Hey everyone, welcome to the show. Today we've got a very interesting guest. His name is Karsten Jensen. And how are you doing today, Karsten?
I'm very well, Claude. Thank you. Thanks for
Awesome.
having me on the show.
Oh, thank you for coming on. And Brian, how are you doing, bro?
Doing all right today. No, I'm
Oh, just an all right.
Uh,
doing good, doing good.
Awesome. So, Karsten, we just want to know a little bit about you. What do you do right now?
I mostly teach something called the flexible periodization method to certified trainers. The flexible periodization method, we say, is a method for creating HIP training programs. HIP is an acronym for holistic, individualized, and periodized training programs, and that's what I spend most weekends on throughout the year.
Right on. So you're a teacher to teachers.
I'm a teacher to teachers. Yes, yes.
Awesome. And how did you get into this field of work?
If you go far enough back, I would say, you can pretty much start with the day you were born. But when you can say a good place to start was that after kind of what corresponds to high school in the Danish school system where I'm from, I went into kind of a semi-university level mathematics and physics, and that took 2 years. And the night when we graduated from that, I said, "Can I see myself going back to this laboratory for the next 4 years every day?" And I couldn't. And I thought, "What do you really like to do? What do I really like to do?" You know, I really liked exercising. I realized that every day when I went out there, the only thing I thought about was going back home and train. So I applied for exercise physiology in the University of Copenhagen, and I started doing that. And then at the second year of that, we had track and field, and I was and probably still is, I haven't done for a while, extremely slow, meaning 14.28 seconds on a 100 meter. So I started becoming interested in what kind of training does it take to make a tortoise into a hare, or at least a faster tortoise. And after a couple of months, I remember sitting in the university library, which is kind of like a big living room compared to North American standards, and thinking, and I got this feeling in my gut that I'm going to be a strength coach. And that's kind of where it started, and I haven't looked back since.
That's awesome. So you were
Yeah,
inspired from like a young age to
yeah. I was 23 at the time.
now the Danish school system. How did they do their phys ed programs? Is it different from what you see here?
I'm not really familiar with the Canadian school system. We don't have kids, so I'm not sure. I think overall in many countries, probably including Denmark, there's less facet than there was in the 70s and early 80s when I went to school. But we saw a documentary the other night that you know everybody's realizing how it hurts really literally all facets of the kids' lives, both intellectually and physical, and it seemed to be on its way back. But we didn't. We played soccer, and sometimes we did the obstacle courses or some of the things I remember. Played volleyball, basketball, all
Okay.
kinds of things. Like I think 2 times 45 minutes, pretty much throughout both elementary school and the equivalent of high school.
So that's only 2 times a week?
Yeah, twice a week
Oh wow,
in the school system. Yeah,
that's not a lot when you think about it. I
no,
mean,
not a lot at all.
yeah, I think over here, at least back when I went to school, when I was 400 years ago,
Yeah.
I think we had to take gym 3 or 4 times a week. But like we just sat around eating ice cream, so it wasn't
Okay.
really
Okay.
like you had to just
Yeah.
show up was about it. Um,
Yeah.
but that's amazing. And how did you develop your periodization system? Because I know there's a Tudor Bumpa. He's got, he's kind of got the, how do I put it, the monopoly on on periodization. So how
Yeah.
does your system kind of
It,
does it
it, it came
align?
around because right out of university, I was hired by the Danish sports system specifically to do individualized training programs for a variety of athletes. And they uh, were both very young. Some of them were very young, meaning 15 or 16, with no background in strength and conditioning.
Hmm.
Others were towards the end of their career, meaning like 31, 32. And in terms of competitive schedule, they were one end of the extreme was a professional tennis player at the ATP level who traveled 30 to 40 weeks a year. And the other end of that spectrum were those really young players who the coaches kept at home maybe for 6 to 8 months at a time. So I read, beginning from the early 90s, I read Bompa, I read Saski-Orsky, I read some of Poliquin's stuff. I read at the time also Flake and Kramer. So I had read everything that I knew of at the time. And all the major books, the textbooks, they gave some of the answers. But I felt continued to feel that something was missing, that there was no single system that answered all the questions that I needed to answer in order to create those training programs for that variety of athletes. And gradually, via inspiration from those sources that I mentioned, I realized that you need a separate system that's flexible enough so we can adjust the various program variables and create a hip, individualized training programs for anyone. And that, you can say, that was really the start of the flexible periodization method, and it has evolved a lot ever since. And when you are ambitious about what you do, I think like most of us are, it will never finish. There will never be the day where we will say, okay, this is what the flexible periodization method looks like, and it's never going to change. It's always going to be integrating the newest research on various components, but the main pillars, they haven't really changed since the start, which makes me feel that you can say I was right on with those things.
Right on. And what do you feel the most difficult part about your creating your system was?
Well, one of the things that I have spent the most time thinking about was ways to apply progressive overload. It took when I first wrote the first book, that was the section that took the longest. And one of the things we applied there was the thing about dependent versus independent variables. To give you an example, in the method operates with different types of blocks or mesocycles, where in the first block in a macrocycle, the goal is to develop endurance of deep stabilizer muscles, something that I was first exposed to or through the check programs. And we dug a little bit more into that research, but one of the guidelines is that these muscles are mostly type 1 muscle fibers, so they are slow twitch. In order to fully stimulate them, you need longer sets. And the guideline, we're using Gary Taylor's research there. So we're going to go for sets that are 2 to 5 minutes in duration as the key thing. So in a block like that, we see that the time under tension as the independent variable, meaning regardless of what happens, we need that time under tension. So we're gonna use, for example, 3 different squat combinations, and someone has to accumulate a total of 3 minutes. They can take very short break, which is the cluster principle, but the set stops when 3 minutes is accumulated, or reps corresponding to 3 minutes. When someone can get 3 minutes without stopping, then we increase the load. So the load increase here is a dependent variable. So depending on how you perform with time under tension, the load is being increased. Opposite to that, in a later cycle, the goal is maximal strength, emphasizing nervous system adaptations. And here, the key thing is to place tension on the maximal tension on the muscle tendon unit. So here, the load is the independent variable. So regardless of what happens, the client is you can say encouraged to increase the load from session to session. But then the program opens for gradually reducing the number of repetitions per set. So here the number of repetitions per set becomes a dependent variable. And that line of thinking, what's the key thing to develop? We all do the same thing with endurance and power training. The key thing to develop becomes the independent variable, the variable that we want to secure no matter what. And then other variables around that has to be dependent, because you can't fix all the variables. You can say that's one of the original critiques of periodization, and it still simmers around, is that some of that thought came from Eastern Europe, when Eastern Europe was strongly influenced by communism, which is described in Sip's book Super Training. And overall in that philosophy, they didn't like the human variability, so they fixed all program variables, meaning they assumed that everybody would show up with the same level of readiness every session, and it would progress in a predictable way from week to week.
So like an assembly line kind of
An
approach.
assembly line, I think. And there's a great anecdote from Ivan Abajev, which was relayed to me by a good friend of mine called Randall Strawson of Ironmind. So he once asked Abajev, what do you do if an athlete stopped making progress? And the question came out of Bulgarian weightlifting using only, I think it's 4 or 5 exercises, because they found those are the only exercises that transfers to the lift. Abajev looked Randall straight in the eyes and said, I take a new athlete. So here, right, the Bulgaria, the athlete had to fit the system, otherwise.
Yeah, the system wasn't going to fit them.
No.
Yeah, that's harsh. It's kind of like that selection bias, like you get 100 guys in, and maybe only 10 will make it. But then people look at the system; it's so successful, but these guys are actually just mutants to begin with.
Yes. Yeah. I remember that's one of the things Paul Chek probably still says, is that some athletes succeed despite their conditioning program.
Yeah.
And I think if whenever someone emulates like the world champion or whatever, which quite often happens, then you have to keep that in mind. Is this really a good, generally applicable training program, or is this just because this person has fantastic prerequisites for succeeding?
Yeah, it's a good question to ask, and sometimes it's a mix, but yeah, you never know what's going to walk through that door.
No.
But sorry, Brian, I've been hogging our guest. You probably have a few questions, knowing you.
I do, and I am used to you hogging our guests with that. Actually, Karsten, I was kind of curious if you might be able to take us through like I don't know, I was thinking like a push-pull periodization using the 4 different periodizations that there is.
The 4 different periodizations that there is?
Yeah.
Which one are you referring to?
Like the block periodization or the
So, Karsten, with your system, because I know Bompa's got the strength, it's not the burn, but it's like the kind of cardio, and then he's got the hypertrophy sort of stuff.
Yeah.
What about your system? Because obviously it's different.
Well, try to rephrase the question, because I'm not sure what you're hinting at. I'd like to answer it as good as I can.
I'm sorry. Yeah, no, I believe there's I believe it was on your website that there were 4 different periodizations. So there's linear, block. There was a third one, and then there's the flexible your philosophy. And I was kind of wondering if you might be able to take our listeners through as simple as possible the different techniques.
So we can say that first of all, the different named systems, including the flexible periodization method, we see those as examples of applications of periodization as a principle. And that's a key distinction that many people miss. So they critique periodization, but they in reality are critiquing examples of periodization. Periodization fundamentally is a strategy for organizing long-term training by dividing a longer training period into shorter periods. So that's the first, I think, the distinction that should be made.
Okay.
The second distinction that should be made, or not a distinction, but the way that we view, or I've used, for example, linear periodization, I don't see it as a big, unalterable system. I see it as a pattern for changing volume and intensity. And the same thing with the non-linear daily undulating periodization, and pretty much the same thing with block as well. So for example, one of the ones that are most easy to communicate or verbally is the linear, which is a gradual decrease in volume with a gradual increase in intensity. Whereas the block would be something with you have the same intensity and volume for a prescribed amount of time, and then there's a sharp increase in intensity and a sharp decrease in volume. Interesting enough, if you look at these two, some of the studies are not a big difference between linear and block periodization. I think what I would like to do, and I think that would come across better, the best answer of your question would have to be in writing. Beyond that, it would be me saying a lot of numbers.
Okay.
But I would like to write a short blog post for your listeners, if you can put it up on your website.
That would be perfect. That would
totally.
That would be the best. Beyond that, an aspect of it is that the reason it's called the flexible periodization method is that it doesn't really follow a prescribed pattern. They would always start with a block which we call ISS, which stands for focusing on weak links, stability, and structural strength, where the sets are a little bit longer, 2 to 5 minutes, where we use hybrid type of exercises. And then gradually over time, the sets become shorter, the exercises change, and the intensity goes up.
Okay. But
I can reproduce all facets of those other systems with the flexible periodization method. And this is the downside of the flexible periodization method, because there's no such thing as a flexible periodization method workout. Because if there were that, it wouldn't be individualized.
Right. Absolutely.
So sometimes it's you think I call it the stealth system. You can only recognize the system based on the results it creates for the people who uses it. And I realized that's a characteristic of the flexible periodization method. When I once spoke to a Canadian level shot putter who came to one of our workshops, and I was interested in his training program, and he had it there for some reason. I think he just came from a workout or something. And I looked at it and I said, "Has your coach received training from Charles Poliquin?" And he nodded yes. His coach had been trained by Charles Poliquin. So this had Charles Poliquin's signature in terms of the type of exercises and the way the tempo was prescribed. And I thought, this is a Charles Poliquin workout. It's not a shot putter workout. You shouldn't be able to see who created the workout or what type of training they have when they look at the workout. You should see who the workout is for. So really, I should only see, okay, this is clearly a shot putter workout. And one of the things that was missing, which we then talked about, is there were no rotational exercises. And he said this was because this was the first program in a macro cycle, which specifically is something that I would disagree with. If you're a shot putter, there should be rotational exercises from the very first day of training. Mm-hmm. Things like wood chops, which you guys are, I'm sure you got a landmine type of exercises. I'm sure you guys are familiar with.
Yeah, we've been around the block.
Yeah.
It's crazy to essentially just have this person working in the sagittal, plane and not have any transverse side to side sort of stuff, because that's what they're doing. It's kind of like just having a tennis player just do squats.
Yes, yes. Yeah, same thing with you. When I trained tennis play, he didn't do squats. He did lunges, a ton of lunges. And I have a good story about that, by the way. I think because of my training, some of the exercises I had a little bit of emotional attachments to were barbell squats and deadlifts from the beginning of my career. Mm. And one of the things, and I'm sure you've heard Paul Chek say as well, don't have any emotional attachments to any exercises. So there were a period of time in the early 2000s when I worked with the Danish national badminton team where we did deadlifts because to emphasize the hip extension, and because some research has shown if you just play a lot of badminton, you develop a quadriceps hamstring imbalance in the way that the quadriceps gets much stronger than the hamstrings. So we favored deadlifts over squats at the time, barbell deadlifts. And we're very careful with technique and progression. But there were a time period over a couple of months where the players who did the deadlifts, they repeatedly went to the physio with backs that had locked up. It wasn't too serious, but they lost a few days of training. So after some time, the national coach and the physio and the doctor, they called me to a meeting and said, "You can't put that in the training program anymore." wasn't really a suggestion or a question. It was an order. You can't put that in the training program anymore. And my initial gut reaction was kind of, how can I train these guys if I can't put squats or deadlift in the training program? But we already did. We did lunges already. We did single leg squats. We did step ups, and we just gotten a sled. So we really started doing that exclusively as lower body work. And nobody ever asked for the barbell squats or deadlifts back, and they did really, really well because of that. And I feel that was the last emotional attachments that I had to any exercise. So it's kind of seen in retrospect, it was a good learning experience. And for example, I do where if I train sprinters, walking lunges, dragging a sled is the first exercise we use. I train hockey players, that's the first exercise. They do squats, but it's not the first exercise, it's the second exercise. So whenever there's anything horizontal or lateral, we use lunges, but with horizontal resistance.
Right on.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, well...
I was chuckling to myself, when you're talking about doing the deadlifts for the badminton players. I know what you were trying to do there, but I don't know how much lifting hundreds of pounds is needed for in a badminton game.
No, where the single players, they need to have a lot of speed strength to accelerate their bodies very rapidly in all directions.
Absolutely.
The double players needed, single players mostly horizontal, to some extent also vertical. Double players mostly vertical. So that lower body strength is definitely relevant. And I would say somewhere close to twice body weight with no gear could be relevant. There's some indication in terms of squatting. I did my master's thesis on that up until you can parallel squat about slightly less than 2 times your body weight, then you can improve your vertical jump by improving your 1RM squat. On the other hand, the same level of upper body strength is not relevant generally.
Yeah, well, if you look at like power lifters, these guys can jump because they're so explosive. If they let go of the bar and they go, they end up, launching into the stratosphere.
Yeah, and the weightlifters as well, man.
Oh yeah, the weightlifters, yeah, they get up there. Yeah, if you don't put 400 pounds in front of them, they can launch.
They can. I have a good friend of mine, a colleague back from Denmark, who competed in the '88 Olympics in Seoul, and he went on to become a strength coach and trained one of the best volleyball teams in Denmark in I think it was early '90s, late '80s, early '90s when he had this experience. So he had jump tested them on a mat, and he had been sitting down in his slippers the whole time. And at the end, he kind of said, "So what can you do?" His name is Kim. "What can you do?" He said, "Okay, I'll try." And he, without no warm up, and in his slippers, he stepped onto the mat and he outjumped all of them. And I haven't spoken to him for a few years, but I believe he keeps up his training. And he has a club, and they dominate both powerlifting and Olympic lifting in Denmark. He's very knowledgeable.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
That's what I like to hear.
Yes. Yeah. But it's all the whole thing about exercise selection, Brian. It's very very intricate and something that I've looked a lot at, the principles of transfer of training and needs analysis, and I definitely try to keep a very discerning mind and not making people stronger than they need to be, not wasting any time looking for that that benchmark thing where you don't get better at your sport by getting even stronger. Mm-hmm. Not say that I make the right decisions all the time, but can say I'm aware of the dynamics of it.
Absolutely, and no, I was just more cracking a joke than anything.
Okay. Yeah.
He thinks badminton players are weak. He obviously hasn't seen some of these guys. They're 6'5" monsters. They could swat me like a fly.
All right. Then I can tell you that if you look at I've saw some of the where you can really see it is in some of the Asian players, their legs are absolutely huge. They're the glutes and the thighs are absolutely huge for that reason. And the same thing with table tennis players, which something we might know even less about in North America. Chinese table tennis players, their legs are huge, and they do squats and they do frog jumps until the sun go down.
No, I played table tennis
Okay.
competitively as a very young child, and like that just boggles my mind. So it's
Yeah.
what other obscure and forgive me anybody who plays these potentially plays these sports, but these other obscure sports that
Send
that
send hate mail to Brian at optimumhuman.com.
Ah.
right that you've trained that strength and conditioning can really help.
I think the other sports that I work with, it's more obvious, but that is the one. If you don't know the sport really well, it's you may not think about it. I trained a race car driver, which he tried to get into Formula One, which was testing.
Mm-hmm.
He was mostly interested in neck strength and VO2 max. I trained horseback riders who needed a lot of leg strength and also VO2 max. But in many places it helps. One of the things I learned from working with those badminton players, the doubles players, there were a couple of guys who they played doubles. I said that, and they were among about the 5 best pairs in the world, and they weren't overly fit. They didn't lift a lot of weight. They couldn't really. We never bench pressed. But it was very, very clear that it would not help them to get any stronger. They were very good because they have very good technique,
Mm-hmm.
they were very good tactical, and they were able to withstand the pressure. The only thing they needed from strength and conditioning was not to get injured. And that's for double players, it's back injuries and shoulder injuries at that place. And what that taught me, I think it's a very important lesson that quite a few strength coaches in North America haven't gotten, is that the purpose of strength and conditioning is not to make athletes stronger. Because if you think like that, you're going to go wrong. The purpose of strength and conditioning is to improve the athlete's abilities to practice and compete. And that's all it is. Sometimes it involves getting stronger, getting a better squat. Sometimes it doesn't. And that is one of the most important things to understand about strength and conditioning.
I totally agree.
I love that. That's mind blowing. That's good
Yeah.
stuff, man.
It's 100% true, because sometimes, like, I've had clients that come in and they're runners or they're hockey players, and they've been trained in the past to be professional exercisers, kind of like,
Yeah,
not like
yeah.
CrossFit style, but like they're doing all this stuff, and I'm just like, this doesn't relate to your sport at all. So we start doing stuff that's a little bit more functional and tactical. I like using
Yeah.
that word, but
Yeah.
like just using it more strategically. And all of a sudden, they're getting faster, they're getting stronger in their sport, because I'm enhancing them. I'm not trying to just make them good in the gym.
No, no.
It's a good point, and I think more people need to hear that.
Yeah. And it relating to what you say there, Claude, is again some trainers will say, coaches will say that you can't train sport specifically, but the rules for transfer of training effects are quite clear. There's a ton of research on it. The Russians started it with the principles of dynamic correspondence. What's his name now? Bondarchuk has written 2 books about it. There's a lot of isolated research on it. That it's about what Mike Stone calls biomechanical and bioenergetic specificity. And SIF adds to that. Well, SIF, it's about stimulating, not simulating the sports movement. And if you kind of get that down, and then you can do really good stuff.
Completely agreed.
Yeah.
And I think if there's any trainers listening, which there probably are, you need to take your clients.
We got one listener.
We got one right now. He's messaging us, telling us he already knows this shit. No, but like they need to realize, they need to train their clients based on the client's goals, not on, because I see a lot of trainers, like let's say powerlifters, they train their clients in powerlifting. They
Yes.
don't do anything else. Bodybuilders, you see them on the leg extension, and I'm like, no, like, why?
Yeah. Yes.
And then when you take it to athletes, it makes it even worse, because they become slower, and they might look more muscular, but if they're a sprinter, they only need so much.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it's about, you can say, what's success as a strength coach. And you can say to some extent there are two levels. It can be one or the other. For example, if somebody gets really strong in the weight room but they lose the matches, nobody's going to be happy. You know, I can kind of sit for myself and say, you know, that was a good lifting program. The athlete's not going to be happy, and the coach is not going to be happy. And if he can fire me, he's probably going to fire me. On the other hand, if the athletes play better and they don't get stronger in the weight room, the coach is going to say, I did that, or the athlete did that. Maybe, you can continue for another year, but we're not really sure, if your work has any form of benefit.
Yeah.
It has to be both, in the sense that they improve in the weight room, and that has correlation to their performance. We have this saying that nobody wants to sit in the locker room and brag about their new 1RM squat after they lost the first game.
Everybody except for Brian.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
He'd be like, look what I can do, guys.
Yes. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
pretty much.
Nobody cares if we lost.
I care, Brian. I care.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Well, and it reminds me of like training women, for instance. Women generally don't want to get big and bulky, and so often they're given a hypertrophy type program, and like, well, what the hell is this? When they
Volume training.
right,
It'll keep you toned by getting you double the size of biceps.
Yes.
So it definitely depends on what the person's goals are.
Yeah, and this thing we're talking about here has other implications. It has implications for gaining the trust of the athlete and the coach. So if you come, for example, with a program that's relatively generic, some athletes will have this subtle feeling that, this is not really what I need. And that feeling is sometimes what will make them kind of don't do the program as soon as the coach look away. On the other hand, with the type of programs that you provide, Claude, where it really is for their sport, and they see, I'm actually getting better at my sport from this, that's going to motivate them even more. And I've also found that many sport coaches, they are mistrusting strength coaches because they think our only interest is to make people stronger, and we want them in the weight room as much as possible.
Well,
and they understand that we are just interested in the athletes performing better, that everybody has the same goal. They start trusting the strength coach more. So it's a total win-win to, literally to the reverse engineer the program based on the needs analysis.
It's true. And now as trainers and strength coaches are getting more knowledge and, changing their mindsets a little bit and being woken up, I think we'll see more and more synergy between, sport coaches and strength coaches, because, the mistrust can be very, very real from both sides.
Yeah.
And sometimes, let's say you've got karate fighters, right? And they're just running around the room, for the first 10 minutes or whatever. And it's like, to me, it doesn't make sense because it doesn't contribute to anything. No. Like, okay, you might get a little bit of endurance, but karate is a very fast twitch sport.
Yeah.
So, to me, that's like old school traditional training where they haven't really thought it through or changed it in like 200 years.
Yep.
And I feel like as we, keep getting through to coaches and keep talking to them, good things will happen because, everybody's going to talk to everyone, and that's communication, honest communication. It's the best way to go.
Completely agree. I completely agree, man.
Yeah, it just, it's hard work to bang some heads in with a hammer, but if you get through, and amazing results happen.
Kettlebells work better than a hammer, Claude.
You know what? This is true. But have you seen that Rogue hammer? It's like $400 on Rogue Fitness.
Wow.
They call it like Thor or Odin's hammer or something.
Thor's hammer, yeah.
It's
Good.
That'll work on someone.
Great tool for overhead athletes, by the way. Badminton players. We got club bells when I worked in the Danish sports system for the badminton and tennis players. Excellent tool for those types of athletes, baseball players, hockey players as well.
Oh yeah, for shoulder health and stability.
Yeah.
It's even like wrist and elbow. It's if you're doing club bells, it's amazing. That's cool. So,
Yeah.
Karsten, just switching gears a little bit.
Yeah.
Right now, you teach, you said every weekend?
We teach approximately 3 out of 4 weekends, 10 months a year.
Right
That's
on.
what you can say, give or take. Let's say it. And we go into different places in the GTA. When we go to, I'm from Denmark, as I said earlier on. When we go to Denmark, I typically teach and do like a session at the university and the Danish Sports Federation. We were just on vacation in Rio, and because some of our friends have connection to the fitness community there, I did a short bodyweight training lecture. We have a bodyweight training program. So we
Oh,
were
cool.
going in depth with push-ups there. I spent twice as much time there because everything was translated, but it was really good. It was really good. Yeah. So I mostly teach. Yeah.
Oh, did you happen to catch the Olympics at all, or were you there at a different schedule?
I'm kind of odd this way in the sense that I'm not really that much into watching sports for entertainment. I'm into watching sports to analyze movement. So we watched not that much of it. We watched it on TV mostly.
Oh, right on.
And also both my wife and I, we kind of sort of prefer that because we like to see, what really happened there. We can see you can see the replays as opposed to no
These,
replays.
yeah, these kind of like ants. Like you can
Yes,
barely see
yes.
anything. You're
We
like,
had
who is
a
that?
we had a great time, and I saw two of the Danish athletes I worked with in Denmark taking silver.
Awesome.
So pretty much 10 years after I left, they're still very, very good. That's great to see.
That's a good feeling.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Right
yeah,
on. No, that's amazing. And just to go into the body weight stuff a little bit.
yeah.
Now, what kind of do you do those clinics in the Toronto area or
We do them in
just
Toronto
around?
area as well. Yeah.
And like, what do you go through in a typical body weight training seminar?
Well, the overall theme is ways to increasing training stimulus without adding training time.
Okay.
So one of the things we go through is what we call really all the technical cues of push-ups, which we have named functional muscle control. So the ability to contract and or relax muscle specific to a movement. So it's things like, press your fingertips into the ground, screw your hands into the ground, reach in opposite direction with the crown of the head and the tailbone. All the things that increases stability and strength,
That's
using
awesome.
using the breath as well.
Yeah, because as easy as the push-up might seem, a lot of people get it incorrect, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, there's a lot to learn. There is, or you can say more. I mean, a lot of people can do a push-up, but you can really fine-tune it and optimize it.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
like a lot of people, I think when they think of push-up, or at least when they do a push-up, they're trying to, push their head into the ground. You see their neck just falling, and I'm like,
Yes.
oh yeah. So that I like that cue, the head and the tailbone stretching. Was it stretching far apart or
Yeah, reaching opposite directions
reaching
with the crown
opposite?
of the head and the tailbone, which is something I learned from like a blog post on Dragon Door a long, long time ago. The guy called Eric Kopp that created See Healthy writes about it, and he writes about how that maneuver you can kind of sort of feel it
Hmm.
that it engages the transversus spinalis muscles more, so it helps make the spine more stable and tolerate more load.
Always helpful.
Yeah, and that is we use the same cue in squats or deadlifts, pretty much any exercise where it's possible. We teach that cue. Teach that cue. But it's not
I'm
easy to do if any of the listeners have lack range of motion in the neck muscles or around the thoracic spine. You have to release that first because otherwise that cue is it's impossible to execute.
I'm totally gonna steal that cue.
Yeah, go for it, man.
I'll,
Go
I'll
for
use
it.
it on myself
Yeah.
too.
Yes.
That's great.
Go
Yeah.
for it.
Pull
Yeah.
your head out of your tailbone there, Claude.
Yeah.
Whoa, relax there, Brian. I'm gonna sick one of those badminton players on you.
Uh-oh.
They'll come
We
after you.
we do another thing we do in that workshop is called antagonist resisted training,
Okay.
where we've seen one study on it where they literally just did air biceps curls with the instruction, as you flex your elbow, resist with the triceps, and they were able to on beginners to show increases in strength. We rarely use it that way though, but we add it to other exercises. So for example, imagine a push-up. Let's say if any of you do 10 to 20 push-ups, or wait, I don't know how many you can do,
Wow.
but what you will know is that just doing the push-up, there are muscle fibers that you could activate that you're not activating. So when we instruct this agonist-antagonist resisted training, there's a focus on an agonist-antagonist pair. In the push-ups, it's mostly the triceps and the biceps. So the simplified instruction is, as you lower and lift yourself, squeeze both your biceps and triceps as hard as you can, all the way down and all the way up. And you will experience that the tempo is going to naturally slow down. So it's definitely not something, if you want to move efficiently, it's not a good cue. But if your goal is muscle mass, and to some extent you can say you don't have access to load and you want to engage more muscle, it's a cue that we recommend.
I like that, and I've heard that somewhere before. I can't place where, but definitely doing this as you were talking, I was doing the bicep curl.
Yeah.
And definitely I remember trying this before, and I'm like, yeah, and it actually works. It's amazing, but
I think it's and I haven't, you can say, tracked it that far back, but I think it tracks all the way back to the dynamic tension thing with child's athletes and some of the techniques used in martial arts as well.
I could see that.
I didn't learn it originally from that resource, but I've later kind of seen hints that's the kind of thing that was being done. So those are some of the techniques we use. Another one is, which is kind of controversial for the people who don't know the research, is respiratory muscle training. You guys familiar with that overall?
No.
No.
Can't say that I've heard about it now.
No, okay. Respiratory muscle training is the type of training where you breathe, you wear a mask and you breathe in and out through the mask.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Where there's really the resistance, the inspiratory and the expiratory muscles, they get loaded, and a lot of research showing that it improves. For example, how long can you run in an hour? And you can run longer. How long can you run on? For how long can you run on 70% of maximum heart rate? You can run longer. If you are a team sport athlete in intermittent sport and you do the yo-yo test, you go to higher levels. What it doesn't do though is, apparently, as far as I've seen so far, is improve VO2 max. And I've seen quite a few posts on Facebook by people who haven't read the research who says it's just a gimmick. It's definitely not a gimmick. So that is, if you are training anyone who needs endurance, is absolutely worth looking into, because it's a way of increasing training stimulus without adding training time.
Okay, cool. And it definitely makes you look cool when you're training.
Probably more cool or yeah.
Like Bane from Batman.
Exactly.
Yeah. Batman. Yeah. We do one variation if someone wants to play with it and don't want to look cool or don't want to buy the apparatus. Just inhaling and exhaling through the nose does, you can say, to some extent does the same thing.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that would limit the oxygen available. But,
it does. So if you run, it makes running a lot harder, or do any type of endurance circuit, makes it a lot harder.
Yeah.
Well, I've got a big nose, so it might be easier for me.
Yeah. Fun.
Anyways, Karsten, we want to be respectful of your time. I got a few quick wrap-up questions here.
Yeah.
So first one is, what is your definition, or who comes to mind when you hear the optimum human?
I would say some of my heroes are guys like I have on my wall here, Albert Einstein and Muhammad Ali. But I think I like the Rumi guy, the Persian philosopher, and I love this quote where he says that you may appear in earthly form, but your essence is pure consciousness. You are the fierce guardian of divine light. I do believe overall that we are all supposed to become more godlike, evolve the consciousness and become more godlike. So the thoughts, and I read a lot about what is spirit, what are the characteristics of spirit, and that's what I try to emulate.
It makes sense, and it totally makes you more accountable to not only yourself but the universe when you start thinking like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I wish more people thought like that. That they could do something to change the world rather than be passive bystanders.
Yep.
But it's getting better, I think.
I think so.
Yeah,
There's
absolutely.
a lot of people now. You used the term waking up before. There's a
Yep.
lot of people start seeing new perspectives on things, and I think what's great about this era and these decades here is that you don't doing these spiritual things are no longer a leap of faith.
Hmm.
There's a lot of research. For example, we follow the Heart Math Institute. They do a lot of great work. I've studied a book called The Field by Lynn McTaggart intensely. We use it in one of our workshops a lot to talk about how we are all connected, what our true nature is. And so it's even if you are logical left brain, you can't just dismiss these types of principles any longer.
Absolutely. When there's black and white science behind it, that definitely makes it.
A little bit more trustworthy.
Yeah,
It
absolutely.
does.
Yeah,
It's easier to accept with both sides of the brain, as opposed to just one side of the brain.
for sure, for sure. And seeing is believing in my eyes. But it's good to, as you
Yeah.
said, have both sides of the brain on board.
Yes,
Yeah.
and then the opposite of that believing is seeing. So
Yes.
Ooh,
Yes. Both of them.
yes, we're
ooh,
getting
Yeah.
deep here.
ooh. I
Yeah.
like it,
Yeah.
Brian. Are you gonna become a guru?
I already am, buddy.
Oh
I already
man.
am.
There's a great story about that in a book called The Biology of Empowerment by Lee Poulos. I think he's a Canadian doctor of some sort. He talks about it must be some form of historical accounts from when Columbus landed in America for the first time. So they anchored the large ships a little bit from the coastline, and they row ashore in smaller boats, and they made contact with the natives. And then they said, we came on those boats out there, and they weren't that far away. They were definitely within, say, visual distance, but the natives couldn't see them. And the
Hmm.
point was they had no concept of boats of that size. And because in their minds they couldn't see that at all. They couldn't see the boats until they were out. Columbus took them out to the boats, and where you can say where it ties into our normal daily life, things that we don't believe, think we have no concept of in our mind, it won't enter our consciousness. So it really is important to expand our consciousness in good constructive ways in order to get a fuller perspective on life.
It's very true. And I use cell phone waves or radio waves as a kind of example that we
Yeah,
don't see everything. There's stuff
Right.
out there. It's there. We know it's there. It's just
yeah,
just because you don't see it doesn't mean that there's not something out there.
Yeah.
I love that example.
Or
Yeah.
the sun at night.
The sun, yeah, yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
It disappears
yeah,
completely.
yeah,
But it's still there. But,
yeah,
Yeah.
yes,
anyways, I'd love to
uh,
actually have you on again and talk solely on this metaphysical
Level.
philosophy. But if you were able to have a billboard, put it anywhere you'd want, where would you want it? What would be on it?
billboard anywhere I want it. And what would be on it? Well, it would probably be what would be on it. It would be, it would be some form of spiritual quote. There are quite a few that I like. The one that comes to mind is another. Yeah, it's another Rumi quote, which is about consciousness as well. Is if you find me not within, you will never find me because I was with you from the beginning. And how that refers to fitness is that you gotta see yourself achieving the goal in consciousness first. You cannot train with the attitude of becoming something that you are not currently are. That's where it's applied. It's a little bit more difficult to say where it would be. I guess when I'm from Toronto, it's just says Dundas Square or something. It's difficult for me to really say
There you
Yeah,
go.
it's like the
Times
for people
Square or
that don't
something.
know, yeah, it's like the Times Square of Toronto or
Times
Canada.
Square,
Yeah.
Toronto, Dundas Square. Yeah,
Yeah. So many,
yeah.
so many billboards and lights and flashing whistles. So, Karsten, if you if you had to choose one book out of all of the books you've read and own, what would be your favorite? You know, what would be the one you'd save in a fire?
I'm saving a fire. One I
Mm.
haven't read yet. Well,
You must have a good memory.
no, the most inspirational book on training that I've ever read, and I think any trainer, anybody who just lived for his own interest would love this book. It's called The Spiritual Journey of Joseph M. Greenstein, and the Mighty Atom, the World's Strongest Man. You guys
Oh
heard of
yeah,
him?
I've heard about him. Yeah.
It is an absolutely phenomenal book that talks about how he grew up in Poland, and he started traveling with a circus and met a great wrestler from India in Gama. And because the Jews were, say I'm lacking the English word here,
Ostracized.
ostracized by the Russians at that time, he went to America, in Texas, worked in the oil fields, gradually became a performing strongman, and is now kind of the grandfather of a lineage of strongmen that involved. Now we talked about hammers before, Slim the Hammerman. And then later Dennis Rogers, who trained a lot of the strongmen you can read about on the internet. As far as I know, he's pretty much trained all of them. So he's kind of the grandfather of a huge lineage.
Yeah.
And it's what's great about this book is that I read it to know about how he approached training mentally, and he was very much into that mental stuff. He really talked about using the life force as strength.
And he was like 5'3" or something, right?
So that's why he became the mighty atom, because he was tiny. He wasn't a big person. There's a lot of great stories about him. One of the ones that I like the most, I heard his son tell on a YouTube video at the time where his son was 94. And the story is that when his son was in school, I think they lived in New York for many years.
Mm-hmm.
In school, the teacher asked them, "So what do your father do?" They were supposed to talk about that. And he said, "My father breaks chains and bite coins." The teacher said, don't lie. Your imagination is too vivid. What does your father really do? And the son went home and told Joe Greenstein that the teacher didn't believe me. So the next day, Joe went to school with his son, and he took out a coin and he bit it over, and he spat it in his hand and gave it to the teacher and say, "When your son tells you something, you believe him." And then he walked out.
Oh, that's great.
I would have loved to meet that man. I think he was a great man.
Yeah, from all the stories I've heard, he sounds pretty epic.
Yes, I think epic is a good way of describing him.
So, Karsten, one last question before we wrap up. Who would you have on the podcast if you had a say, and you might have a say if we can get this person?
Who would have on a podcast?
Yeah, anyone you want to hear in particular?
I think one of the guys that I like a lot, I think is phenomenal. You guys should try to get is Bruce Lipton. He's written a book called Biology of Belief. Mm-hmm. He's phenomenal. He's very, very engaging and funny, and talk about how he's very much into cells and how they react to the environment, and talk about the things that the things you researched. How does this apply to fitness? I think that would be very interesting.
Yeah, we'll totally look into it.
That's one of the. You can say that's one that comes to mind.
Awesome.
I think another guy that I know I've spoken to personally, which has a very good outlook on training and mental strength in general too, is called Mike Gillette.
Okay, I think I've heard of him.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
Right on.
Yeah.
All right, well, we'll definitely look into getting these folks on. So where can people find out more about you, Karsten, and what you do?
We have a website called yes2strength.com, and we're also on Facebook, where you can find me by writing in my name in the search box, Karsten Jensen.
Perfect. We'll have links to it for sure.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on, Karsten. This was definitely, it felt like I was I was at home talking to you here. It really resonated with me.
Thank you. Likewise, Claude.
Yeah, it was really good, man. I appreciate you coming on. Definitely, um,
We'll have to get you back.
absolutely look forward to it.
I would love to do that. Thanks, Brian, as well.
All right. Cool.
All
Thanks so
right.
much,
It's
Karsten.
good. Thank you.
Thanks, Karsten. Bye bye.
Bye.